Chapter 1 of Davy and the Goblins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Francis Brown. Davy and the Goblin by Charles E. Carryl. Chapter 1. How the Goblin Came. It happened one Christmas Eve, when Davy was about 8 years old, and this is the way it came about. That particular Christmas Eve was a snowy one and a blowy one, and one generally to be remembered. In the city where Davy lived, the storm played all manner of pranks, swooping down upon unwary old gentlemen and turning their umbrellas wrong side out, and sometimes blowing their hats quite out of sight. And as for the old ladies who chanced to be out of doors, the wind came upon them suddenly from around corners, and blew the snow into their faces, and twisted their petticoats about their ankles, and even whirled the old ladies themselves about in a very painful way. And in the country where Davy had come to pass Christmas with his dear old grandmother, things were not much better, but here people were very wise about the weather, and stayed indoors, huddled about great blazing wood fires, and the storm, finding no live game, buried up the roads and the fences, and such small fry of houses as could readily be put out of sight, and howled and roared over the fields and through the trees in a fashion not to be forgotten. Davy, being of the opinion that a snowstorm was a thing not to be wasted, had been out with his sled, trying to have a little fun with the weather, but presently discovering that this particular storm was not friendly to little boys, he had retreated into the house, and having put his hat and his high shoes and his mittens by the kitchen fire to dry, he began to find his time hang heavily on his hands. He had wandered idly all over the house, and had tried how cold his nose could be made by holding it against the window panes, and I am sorry to say that had even been sliding down the balusters and teasing the cat, and at last, as evening was coming on, had curled himself up in the big easy chair facing the fire, and had begun to read once more about the marvelous things that had happened to little Alice in Wonderland. Then, as it grew darker, he laid aside the book and sat watching the blazing logs and listening to the solemn ticking of the high Dutch clock against the wall. Then there stole in at the door a delicious odor of dinner cooking downstairs, an odor so promising as to roast chickens and baked potatoes and gravy and pie as to make any little boy's mouth water. And presently Davy began softly telling himself what he would choose for his dinner. He had quite finished fancying the first part of his feast, and was just coming in his mind to an extra large slice of apple pie well browned, staring meanwhile very hard at one of the brass knobs of the andirons to keep his thought from wandering, when he suddenly discovered a little man perched upon that identical knob, and smiling at him with all his might. This little man was a very curious-looking person indeed. He was only about a foot high, but his head was as big as a coconut, and he had great bulging eyes like a frog, and a ridiculous turned-up nose. His legs were as slender as spindles, and he had long pointed toes to his shoes, or rather to his stockings, or for that matter his trousers, for they were all of a piece, and bright scarlet in color, as were also his little coat and his high pointed hat and a queer little cloak that hung over his shoulder. His mouth was so wide that when he smiled it seemed to go quite behind his ears, and there was no way of knowing where the smile ended, except by looking at it from behind, which Davy couldn't do as yet without getting into the fire. Now, there's no use denying that Davy was frightened. The fact is, he was frightened almost out of his wits, particularly when he saw that the little man, still smiling furiously, was carefully picking the hottest and the reddest embers out of the fire.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?